Hey, Freedom Church, can you believe that we are already halfway through the first month of this new year? It's flying by. Over the past couple of weeks, we have been walking through a few of the major stories and themes within Genesis. And so far, we've journeyed through the creation story. And as we focused in on Genesis 1 and God's creation, we really paid close attention to God's unique creativity throughout this whole reading. And last week, we spent a little bit of time in the garden with Adam and Eve. And this was a tough place to be, if I could be honest, because what we started to see develop was how disobedience led to discipline and how our choices have consequences. But even after all of this, the God of creation still pursued, he still covered, and he still cared so much for his creation. So our scripture for today comes from Genesis 6. This is where we're going to spend our entire time together, right here in this chapter. So if you just go ahead and take a moment and make your way there, Genesis 6. I'm not sure that you really need to be a biblical scholar to recognize this story, particularly from the Old Testament in Genesis. In fact, I believe, if not all of you, have heard the story of Noah and the ark at some point. And if you are still in a place where you're not really sure of this story, just be blessed, man, because we're going to read it together right now. So Genesis chapter 6, beginning in verse 9 reads, "This is the account of Noah and his family. Noah was a righteous man, blameless among the people of his time, and he walked faithfully with God." Verse 10 says that Noah had 3 sons, Shem, Ham, and Japheth. Now the earth was corrupt in God's sight during this time, and it was full of violence. Verse 12 says, God saw how corrupt the earth had become, for all the people on earth had corrupted their ways. So God says to Noah, I'm going to put an end to all people, for the earth is filled with violence because of them. I'm surely going to destroy both them and the earth. So make yourself an ark of cypress wood, make rooms in it, and coat it with pitch inside and out. This is how you are to build it. The ark is to be 300 cubits long, 50 cubits wide, and 30 cubits high. Make a roof for it, leaving below the roof an opening 1 cubit high all around. Put a door in the side of the ark and make a lower, middle, and upper deck. I'm going to bring floodwaters on the earth to destroy all life under the heavens, every creature that has the breath of life in it. Everything on earth will perish. But I will establish my covenant with you, and you will enter the ark. You and your sons and your wife and your sons' wives with you. Verse 19 says, you are to bring into the ark 2 of all living creatures, male and female, to keep them alive with you. 2 of every kind of bird, of every kind of animal, and of every kind of creature that moves along the ground. They'll come to you to be kept alive. You are to take every kind of food that is to be eaten and store it as food for you and for them. Verse 22 closes and it says, Noah did everything just as God commanded him. Have you ever thought about how God has shaped you? Sometimes I get lost in the wonder as I take a moment and look back and try to piece together all the different pieces from God's design in my life, especially in times where I couldn't really see or understand what was really taking place in front of me. I couldn't understand what God was doing in that specific moment in time. No matter how many shifts, no matter how many turns, I'm always blown away by the end result, because what I know in my life is that no matter how much joy, no matter how much hurt, no matter the pain, no matter the moments of celebration, the victories, the times when I can rejoice, the times where there's defeat. Each piece was placed perfectly. All these little details come together to create this awesome overall image of God's design for my life. It's unique. Nobody else has the same as me. And I need to hear this from time to time. I need to be reminded of what God has done in the past and what he is currently doing right now in these moments, right? These moments, these reminders help me. Because of God's faithfulness, I have placed all my hope in what is yet to come. I have this past, present, future idea of faith. And now I can sit here right at this moment and make this story seem like a breeze. But the truth is that it's not always as easy as letting go and letting God. For example, there were times where God had already paved the way for me, but I couldn't recognize the next steps that required my participation. I couldn't recognize the areas where he has already asked me to move, to do something, to move in obedience, to get to a place where he's asking me to be. And these are the moments where the weight of everything really comes down to choosing specific approaches, to making significant decisions. Now, I'm just wondering if you can relate to this anyway. Can you recognize all these little pieces? How did the individual moments in your life bring you to this very moment? Think about that for a second. I believe God has strategically placed all of us in different seasons for a specific purpose. And not only does he place us in these different areas, in these different seasons for a purpose that he's created us for, I also know that he asks us for obedience even when it doesn't make sense to us, and especially he asks us for obedience when it doesn't make sense to others, to those who we share what he may be speaking to us. A couple of summers ago, we were attending family camp with our church and with our district leaders. And as my family enjoyed the activities and fellowship of our district family, I just remember feeling challenged because during this time, right after family camp, I was going to preach 2 Sundays in a row, and I have yet to prepare for what I was going to speak on. So I served lunch and dinner at camp, and this prevented me from being everywhere all at the same time with my family. But I didn't want to miss out on the opportunities of just spending time with them. But I also recognized that I needed to make a way to prepare my heart to hear and to put together a message for the upcoming Sundays. So I studied, and it was difficult because being away from my office mixed with a schedule that really left little to no room for preparation. And it's challenging because I've grown accustomed to this style of preparing, and so it was a challenge. And through all of this, God really changed my heart, and he really completely rearranged, if I could be honest, what I thought I knew as Noah's story in Genesis 6. So today I believe that this story will not only allow you to recognize all of the little details within your account from a biblical perspective, but I also believe that you're probably never going to look at this story of Noah and the ark the same. So erase your perceptions of the story. Forget about everything that you may have heard or what you recall about Noah and the ark. And I just want to ask you some things along the way, because what I believe is that our culture has presented this story as more of a nursery decor and a children's story. Now, there's nothing wrong with that. But if I were to ask you to pick a topic for us to teach on that has some deep theological roots, I believe that most would overlook Genesis 6, the story of Noah and the ark, as a candidate. And if we limit the story as merely a lesson for children's church, which again, it's not wrong, but we also run the chance of missing out on some powerful stuff in God's word, especially when it comes to the shallow perception that we possess with this story in itself. So think about it for a second. If you have kids, how many times have your children come from church explaining to you the story of Noah and the ark? How many times have you heard any child, for that matter, recite to you the story of Noah and the ark? Maybe this is not you. How about nursery decor? At some point in your life, you have come across some of those little adorable animals that are just smiling with their little cute heads hanging out the window, representing a few animals just sticking their heads out of the ark. And it's all printed on the soft crib rail, the bumper pad. And then in fact, Fisher-Price still makes this little people set of Noah's Ark. I looked the other day, it's on Amazon. It's $35.02. It's in stock, it's available for Prime shipping. So if you're right there, you can order it, warm your heart up, watch your little one belly crawl around the floor while drowning little rhinos and zebras with drool. Now, don't get me wrong. The Noah's Ark nursery decor is hip. I like it. In my opinion, and she's not here to hear me, but if Melissa was here to hear me and we were to have another little bundle of joy, I could totally support a Noah-themed nursery. But this perception of nursery in children's story that has been intertwined in Genesis 6 is also a great way to kind of dampen down a real powerful story that is also very challenging to understand, especially when it comes to the beginnings of something that require obedient faith, even when we cannot see all the details. So let's define this a bit with the instructions God gives Noah beginning in verses 14 through 16. He says, "Make yourself an ark of cypress wood. Make rooms in it. Coat it with pitch, both inside and out. And then this is how you're going to build it. The ark is to be 300 cubits long, 50 cubits wide, 30 cubits high." Verse 16 says, "Make a roof for it, leaving below the roof an opening 1 cubit high all around. Put a door in the side of the ark and make lower, middle, and upper decks." Now, you may be hearing these instructions as I speak them to you, and you're probably thinking to yourself, well, that sounds pretty much of what I would imagine as instructions to build a ship. And you're correct. I'm not going to argue that. But you only know this because this is something that you have already been familiar with. This is something that you've already seen. So let's add a little logic to this set of instructions in Noah's context. Noah didn't live in a time where shipyards created luxury liners that tackled the seas that we can just have a good time on vacation on. In fact, probably contemporary knowledge of shipbuilding was very limited at best. So if you have that in mind and thinking about this idea of shipbuilding, where do we begin? I would ask what an ark is. In verse 14, God told Noah to build this ark and to use cypress wood. And as I kind of processed through that, right off the bat, I started coming to some conclusions. And I was assuming that Noah either one, has knowledge about lumber. And not only does he have knowledge about lumber, but he knew where to find cypress. Or two, this is the first moment where he's probably experiencing the very beginning of a search for materials that are nowhere near familiar to him. And as he attempts to follow these instructions to this thing that's also really unfamiliar to him. And this is no small task. Not only will Noah have to gather all of the cypress, but once he gathers all this raw wood, he's going to have to mill it himself, right? There is no bandsaw or chainsaw milling equipment. This is all hand labor. And then after the wood supply is in order, then he would need to take on the next steps of God's instructions, right? Which is to begin to fabricate this enormous thing, this enormous structure. And then once he has it built, to coat it with this stuff called pitch inside and out. So I looked up pitch and I was just wondering like what this consisted of and how does this waterproof? So it would make total sense when I read through it that this is something that most shipbuilders of that time would have made, even in their older days with the wooden vessels. But Noah, he wasn't going to Lowe's or Home Depot to pick up a can of pitch. He had to make it himself. So as I studied through some of the methods of how they make this, especially in the years of early shipbuilding, pitch was crafted by basically gouging a herringbone pattern into a pine tree. And then what would happen is the pine resin, it would begin to seep out and run down the tree. And as it ran down the tree, it's collected in some sort of basin until basically the resin was finished flowing when the tree was dried up. So once this all happened and the tree was finished flowing, then the tree was cut down and they would cover this tree in some type of soil or ash. And it would burn slowly underneath that. And it would produce this lightweight form of carbon called charcoal. So I want to stop right there and say to all my grilling friends and enthusiasts, and you know who you are, notice in this building of the Ark, they didn't use propane. It was charcoal. So I'm just going to leave that one there for you. But all kidding aside, the final step in this process was to really collect all the resin in the basin, over fire, bring it to a boil, and then slowly mix in this charcoal powder. And what would happen, you get this form of this pitch. So from an engineering standpoint, we're still hanging in verse 14. What we see is God instructing Noah that this vessel was to have not only pitch and built up, and it needs to have rooms. So if you can imagine a stable type setup with many different stable areas for the animals, different compartments. And then you got to imagine like how big this has to be, because it has to be enough to house 2 of every animal, every critter, right? I get so fascinated because there's so many of them on TV now. I can't even keep track. So if you think about this, take into account in the consideration also the orderly division that needed to take place so that the animals on the vessel will be balanced. You can't put all the rhinos and elephants on one side, right? Because too much movement to one side or the other, I'm pretty sure that the Ark would go into some dangerous territory and it could possibly sink. So verse 15 and 16, it pretty much gives us the idea of the instructions to this very size of this vessel. And then 15 leads out, it says, this is how you're going to build it. The Ark is to be 300 cubits long, and that's roughly about 450 feet. That's about 34 stories if it's laying on its side compared to like a high rise. So 50 cubits wide and 30 cubits high, that's 75 feet wide and about 45 foot high. He says, leave below a roof after you make it and cut an opening there. And we want to make that about 18 inches all around. But then I want you to put a door in the side of the Ark and make a lower, middle, and upper deck. So the size of the vessel, right here, if we calculate this in our minds, based off of these calculations, it's about 500,000 cubic feet. And I can't imagine what would happen if you try to calculate everything that you need for something this big. And then, you know, while you're finishing up and getting everything ready, God instructs him to go ahead and cut out some windows and make a main entrance on the lower level. So I'm thinking as he's doing this, man, Noah, do not mess up or else you're going to have to mill this whole thing again. You're not going to go buy wood that you messed up cutting, right? Because we always measure twice and cut once. I think Noah's taught us that. So now that your imagination is filled with the size of this giant hope it floats structure, I want you to imagine the process, the labor, the time that it would have taken to gather all the resources needed to mix up enough pitch just to cover 1.5 million cubic feet. Can you imagine that? Imagine the miscalculated material, because sometimes I do that. Imagine the miscellaneous material. Imagine the items that weren't really necessary in the instructions, but over time as Noah built, he figured out that there's some items that he could use that helped him make this fabrication a little bit easier on him. So he probably wished at some point that there was a little bit more regarding the instructions that God gave him. But I also want you to take in consideration that Noah and humanity, they have yet to experience rain, let alone a giant ship. And Noah was probably had no clue what the Ark was. So imagine building something on this scale. Imagine building anything really without super fine detail or a prototype that you can look at without building something without being familiar with the design. We talked about this in week 1 when we talked about God's creation. But being able to have the confidence that this monster of a project would, in fact, actually float without the support from anyone around him. They think he's crazy. Without something tangible to use as a reference. Nobody knows what he's building. But completely trusting that the Lord has a plan. In blind obedience, God strategically placed Noah in this season for a specific purpose because God knew that, number one, Noah would walk in obedience when it did not make sense to him. And number two, God knew that Noah would in fact walk in obedience even when it didn't make sense to the people around him. Now, with all of this within Genesis 6 presented in a deeper fashion, I want to ask you, do you believe that God strategically places us in different seasons for specific purposes? And if you say yes, or you can say, yeah, I can recognize this, I want to ask you this. What season has he placed you in right now at this very moment? And furthermore, if you recognize that the Lord has placed you in this very season for this exact moment, not yesterday, not today, right here in this second, do you believe and do you recognize a specific area within this season where he is asking you for obedience, even if it does not make sense? Because we live in a season that doesn't make sense. So think about Noah's charge to build this mega ship in a time and place where this design was probably, and I'm pretty convinced that it was completely foreign. Now, maybe you're here right now in this moment and you can say, yes, I believe that the Lord has placed me right here for such a time as this. And not only do I believe that, but I believe that he has a specific purpose for me. Yet here's where I get tied up, because what he asked me seems kind of cloudy. And even though I do trust him, I'm still hesitant to move because I cannot get the support from others around me. They don't see the larger picture. So when I share my ideas, it's never really embraced. I'm going to tell you to wipe away the cute children's story of Noah and the ark for just a moment and dig a bit deeper. Because what God is asking of you right now, right within this moment, what God-sized dream have you been holding on to because you do not have the every detail or instruction? Can you imagine what our world would be like today without the obedience, the blind obedience, the obedient faith of those who have walked before us? This is, in fact, a starting place. There is a beginning, but you will not advance to where God has called you. Hear me. You're not going to get to where God has called you, where he's gifted you, where he has strategically placed you for such a time as this, unless you are willing to say, yes, Lord, I will, even when you cannot see. Will you trust him today? Will you take what he has already given you and use it for something far greater than yourself, something much greater than you could even imagine? So as we wrap up, I want to leave you with some encouragement. It just touched my heart, this whole series. And as we sit here, as I've shared with you already, it's important to dive in. It's important for us to dig a little bit deeper past some of the common Bible stories, specifically the ones that we recall in our memories, such as Noah's Ark. And this very story within Genesis 6, I think it's a great example of just what it means to take a deeper dive. This is a great opportunity. When I initially studied this passage at family camp a couple years ago, I was reminded then, just as I am reminded right now, that no matter how chaotic the world is around me, no matter how chaotic the world is around us, that no matter how many unknowns lie before me, no matter how many unknowns lie before us, no matter how many little details I may have or not have, the one thing that I know for sure for creation is this, is that if I can hear the Lord God direct me, if I can hear him calling me, and if I can walk obediently in faith, even when I cannot see what's in front of me, then I can trust that he is making a way for something new, brand new, and will protect me throughout this entire journey. My question to you is, do you believe that today? If you do not take anything away from this message, I want you to hunker down on this. Grab onto this very gospel of Jesus Christ that is presented here in God's initial instruction to Noah, particularly in verse 14. Now, you may not see this, but I'm going to read it to you. Verse 14, it reads again. So make yourself an ark of cypress wood, make rooms in it, and coat it with pitch, both inside and out. Now, you may be asking yourself right now, I don't know how this represents anything from the gospel I know. Well, the word pitch in Hebrew is kafar, and this is significant. Kafar in Hebrew means to cover, to make an atonement, to make reconciliation, to cover over with pitch. Since the boat that he made, the ark, needed covering to keep it from sinking, the occupants, also the animals inside, needed a covering. They needed atonement. They needed God's grace to keep them from sin and destruction. Remember why he was making the flood in the original place anyway. And not only does this word pitch redirect my thinking when moving in obedience when God calls, but the word pitch, it really proclaims God's hand when we move in spirit, not flesh. Because we can come up with all kinds of fancy Christian things, fancy ideas to just gain some attention, to gain some likes, to gain some responses. And we can take a stand and proclaim to many across social media, throughout the world for that matter, what is typically expected of us as believers at any given moment in time. We can respond out of flesh, not out of spirit. Flesh fades. Spirit is forever. Flesh participates with words for a season. Spirit is defining action all the time. It never goes away. So when we come together and build and proclaim what we want to make a great name for ourselves, yet all without God's covering, this is what is clearly presented of the body of believers and what they did in Genesis 11:3, better known as the Tower of Babel, right? 11:3 in Genesis says that they built this tower and it was covered in tar. They baked these bricks, but there's no mention of pitch in there. There's a difference. God will deal with those who selfishly misrepresent the gospel. Remember, your actions speak louder than any word ever will. And because of that, there is a clear difference between the true gospel and a man-made gospel. If you ask any young person in our culture today for their perspective on this, they're going to tell you the truth. There's a difference between a true calling from God compared to selfish ideology that kind of plays the part claiming his call. And the difference is his covering, his pitch. Just as God covered Noah, God covered Moses. If you look in Exodus 3:2, it tells us of Pharaoh's daughter and her answer and obedient call to God. And it illustrates this again, God's covering. Right in verse 2, it says, when she could not hide him no longer, she got a papyrus basket for him and coated it with tar and pitch. Know today that wherever God is calling you, as you walk in his obedience, as you walk in his atonement, as you experience his grace and live in his love, he is there the entire way. Even if no one around you supports you, even if everyone thinks that you have some crazy ideas. Because here's the truth. If God has called you, no one else matters. You are the one that he wants. You are the one who must answer. He selected you for this given time and this given season for a specific purpose. And if he has called you, you will build with and be covered by God's pitch. He will keep you from sinking. And not only will he keep you from sinking, he will protect you from destruction and the chaos that lurks around every corner. God bless you as you go, knowing that the invitation of God to move from comfort to insecurity, from what we know to what we have yet to experience or what we have yet to discover, from where we have been to where we have yet to go, and from safety to a place of risk, if I could be honest. Go in the name of Jesus, the very one who said, "Follow me," without saying once where he was going. Just a promise of transformation and relationship with the triune God along the journey. God bless you. See you next week.